Welcome to the inner world of filmmaking. I'm your host, Tammy Magaro. I'm an editor, podcaster, and still photographer. In this show, I will interview filmmakers in all facets of production and distribution. In this episode, we explore the inner world of the Gibraltar Project, a documentary about abortion access, reproductive justice, and the unraveling of American democracy. I'm so excited to have director Rosita Laila. Welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me today. It's great. It's great to be here. Sorry.
Oh, good. No. It's great to have you. So we were just talking before we started recording about our connection, and it's through Rachel Hastings, who was the DP on this project. And it's such a small world with how we get connected to each other.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I find that one's career and one's collaborations in the arts can be this string of chance meetings and amazing sparks kind of fly, and you never know with that kind of fellow artist that you meet that what you might in the future wind up doing together and for how long and how many. But it's always such an amazing thing that I find in this I don't want to say industry because it's more than an industry, but in this way of being as artists.
Yeah, and I think it's totally evolving. It just feels like there's more camaraderie, between the filmmakers than maybe I've experienced in the past. And it just feels like it's kind of a fun world when you get to be on projects and then you're like, I know you, and I know you. And it feels like kind of like a family.
Yeah.
Because you're working on projects for an extended amount of time, too.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, and my background, most of my professional career was international and abroad pre-COVID. And when you're living in these expat societies, it's almost like a small town community within the large metropolis. I was in Shanghai, a city of 21 million people, and 1 million were expats. So you wind up having, it's almost kind of like that college campus kind of small community kind of a feel, but like I said, in the middle of a metropolis. But through that, especially when you're working in the arts, and especially working in the arts in a place like China at the time, where there isn't freedom of expression like there is over here in the West, you get very close very quickly because it's also a matter of survival, and you are constantly living in a way that forces you to realize the mortality of the art that you are creating. We were doing theater at the time. So at any moment, at any time, it could be taken away from us. And when you're constantly living like that, you appreciate every single little moment of collaborations, the ups, the downs, the whole journey of putting projects together.
Wow. I mean, it does keep you present, doesn't it?
Very much so. Very much so.
So why don't you tell us what inspired you to tell this story?
Well, with the Gibraltar Project, it was very organic. It really fell into my lap. I wasn't searching out a documentary. My background is mostly narrative film. And I was in September 2020 and October 2020 and a bit of August 2020, I was over in Gibraltar and the border town La Linea in Spain, visiting my grandmother and visiting family and visiting my aunt as well. So they all live there. My grandmother is from there. And I was in the middle of kind of having a break because funding for a larger project had just fallen through right before COVID. And I just needed a break from all things film producing and film finance chasing and all of that. And I went there just to kind of to get a feel for the place. As expats, or former expats, we're always searching for that next place, right?
Right.
And while being there in Gibraltar, which is a British overseas territory, I got in with some of the theater community there naturally. It was while meeting with them and hanging out with them. The other reason I had wanted to go to Gibraltar was to do some last interviews with my grandmother. I've been developing a story about her life as a professional flamenco dancer growing up under Franco's Spain. And so she had a stroke and she hasn't been doing well. So I knew I had to get there. And in the process of my research and in better understanding the place of both Gibraltar and La Linea, with these theater folks who lived there the whole life, I was like, well, I understand a lot of like the Spanish side of things, but the British Gibraltar, I don't. And so during that conversation, they kept saying things like, Gibraltar is so old-fashioned. Gibraltar is so old-fashioned. I turned to them. I'm like, what are you talking about?
Right.
Gibraltar is this gorgeous little gem on the Mediterranean. It sometimes it feels like Silicon Valley on the Mediterranean. Super modern, super wealthy, educated. Not super wealthy, but enough. A big difference between the border towns in Spain. English speaking and all of this kind of stuff. And I was like, what do you mean it's old fashioned here? And they said, well, for example, abortion is illegal here. I'm like,
Oh, wow.
Excuse me? You're British. It's been legal in the UK before it was legal in the United States. And they said, well, that's not the end of it. The abortion is illegal even in cases of rape and incest. I'm like, now mind you, this is in 2020 before everything's been kicking off in the US. And then they said, oh, and the punishment is life in prison. And it's life in prison for you and whoever helps you out. And I'm like, oh my God, I've walked through the twilight zone here. And so we obviously started talking about that. And then they said, oh, meet Steph. She's one of the leaders of the pro-choice campaign that's risen up here organically. I'm like, oh, okay, let's start chatting. So she started telling me the story and things such as the fact that before 2018, when abortion was decriminalized in Ireland, which they were inspired by, even the word abortion, the topic of abortion as a topic was so taboo in Gibraltar. And mind you, Gibraltar is over 80% Catholic. So even though they're British, it's very different than the UK, which is mostly majority Protestant.
Right.
But, I like to say a lot of them are Catholic or a bit, flexible in terms of it's not like Malta, it's a bit different. But still, it has a huge influence and it is intertwined into society more and more over there as you start peeling the onion. But long story short is that Steph started telling me about the journey of how this group of women organically at the grassroots level came together in Gibraltar and said, enough is enough. We need to come out of the, 16th, 18th, 17th century here and decriminalize abortion because this is ridiculous. We shouldn't have to go across the border to back alley clinics to get an abortion and then be afraid to talk to our doctors about aftercare when we come back to Gibraltar, where you guys are bragging about the amazingness of our medicine, and yet we can't get the care we need as women. So that started a whole journey for these women, which started in 2018 and continued through 2019. And she was explaining to me how eventually they got Parliament to pay attention because they didn't want to in the beginning. And it came through one of them getting an article in The Guardian in the UK. So that kind of put pressure on to have Parliament pay attention to this. And Parliament actually voted to decriminalize abortion. But there was such an uproar from the pro-life side that they said, okay, we're going to put it to a referendum about whether or not it's going to come into whether or not we're going to enact it. So then you can vote and blame yourself. So I was like, oh my God.
Oh my God.
So this is all happening throughout 2019. And then they set a date for the referendum, which was March of 2020. And everything is building. They had these big rallies in February of 2020. The girls from Ireland, or the women from Ireland, came over. That the pro-choice side over there, leading the campaign over there, they were very supportive of the Gibraltar for Yes campaigns, as it were. And so building up. And mind you, this is a small community, so it's extremely divisive as an issue, to the point where you have adult grandchildren pitted against their more conservative traditional grandparents, so it's that divisive, way more than what we see here in a very kind of like microscopic way, if you were looking at this under a petri dish, which was fascinating to hear about. And then building up 1 week before the referendum happens, Gibraltar shuts down for COVID. So you can imagine, it's as if like the most contentious midterms or the most contentious presidential election is happening and everybody's energized. Boom. Okay, it's not happening. like literally not happening.
Wow.
Because this was like, beginning of COVID, so whole country shuts down. Nothing is
Right.
happening. And as she was telling me this was about 6 months after this shutdown had happened, but it's still COVID time. So it's October 2020. They were in limbo. Nothing had been rescheduled. Nothing had been done. So there's just been like 6 months of this.
Uh-huh.
And as she had been telling me the whole story, I started to see it in my head as a film. And I said, oh my God, this would be such an amazing documentary. And especially when she was talking about the feelings of the pro-life side versus the pro-choice side. And I'm like,
Mhm.
oh, that's completely mirrors in the US, the same sentiments oftentimes of the pro-choice and the pro-life. And as it was kind of coming in my head in that moment as how great this would be as a documentary, I was like, well, it'd be fantastic then to turn it back around and compare it to the United States in terms of, oh, look, this place in the old world, as it were, across the ocean, they also have these issues with abortion. And believe it or not, the pro-choice side and the pro-life side are both screaming the same things at each other, So it's kind of like that, because really the focus was this incredible journey of organically these women coming together on both sides, mind you, both the pro-choice and the pro-life side, and advocating and getting Parliament to take it up, and then getting the referendum scheduled, and then boom, 1 week before COVID.
Now, do you have a camera, or were you thinking, okay, because you're there, so you're
I
probably
mean,
wanting to.
no, I only had my phone. I didn't have a camera. So
Oh.
I was already scheduled to come back to the US a few days later. So it was something that I knew I would have to come back to cover.
Okay.
But I'd met with folks to kind of like lay the groundwork of connection, so that we could keep chatting via WhatsApp and Zoom and all of that, because there's a whole side to documentary, which is the research and preparation side as
Right.
well, and so I came back to the United States. I started kind of diving into the research side of it, especially on the Gibraltar side, to kind of get familiar with the nuances of the issue and of the journey, now that I had the kind of broad strokes. And then along the way, I worked on a gig in December of 2020 and wound up meeting my feature cinematographer, which was Rachel Hastings, who is the one who also
Yes.
introduced us. And Rachel has this amazing breadth of experience in the world of documentary. And she and I really hit it off as friends and creatives. And I asked her if she would be willing to collaborate with me on the documentary, and she said yes. And, that was amazing. And so that was December of 2020. So really, it would have been January of 2021 that we really started actively trying to seek some angel investors and finance. And we had found an angel investor, and then at the last minute, he disappeared on us, like literally disappeared, as he decided to
Oh.
go on a midlife crisis journey with a touring DJ.
Okay.
Nice guy, but seriously left us in the lurch. And especially then we wound up getting a call from Gibraltar, because Gibraltar had announced the rescheduling of the referendum vote for June of 2021. So we were like, oh my gosh, we know we have to get back now. And in the meantime, I had been doing loads of interviews with pre-interviews, I should say, off-camera pre-interviews with folks in Gibraltar, and other kind of laying out the groundwork for going back. So we had to wind up bootstrapping it, running a very quick Indiegogo campaign, using what we had in our savings to get back to Gibraltar in time for the referendum vote, which we did. And we were the only documentary crew there, and then one of three press type folk there. It was like us, the Associated Press, and then the local GBC, Gibraltar Broadcasting Corporation folks. So,
Wow.
and we were there on the front lines. You can literally see photos of me like right there in front, and then there's the podium with them announcing the vote. Oh, it was pretty amazing, actually. And everybody there is really, really lovely. Both sides, and it was a very fascinating thing to watch, such a divisive issue. And happen, and the vote happened, and then the decision came out, and then afterwards both sides are hugging each other.
Okay, so how has it evolved from what you thought the story would be about to what it ended up becoming?
It's evolved organically, naturally, in some ways a nuanced way. I think that perhaps in the back of my head, originally I was approaching it very much as an artist in that, oh, this is a fantastic story, the ups and downs of the journey of how this vote came to be in Gibraltar. However, the universe always has a funny way of mixing things up a bit, I find. And just as we were gearing up to go back to Gibraltar, in the United States, the issue of abortion was really coming more to the forefront than even before. I mean, of course, there had been the kind of Georgia, Alabama heartbeat bills from a few years ago. I wasn't here for a lot of that. I was actually still abroad, but still, it was like in the news, but not to the level that it was becoming in the spring of 2021 because of Oklahoma passing the new kind of heartbeat law that they did, and then Texas pretty quickly following suit, late spring, early summer by that time. And so this was right before we flew out to Gibraltar, actually, was when Texas instituted SB8. So we left with SB8 just happening and that high school senior giving the speech, the incredible valedictorian speech that she did. That happened, right before we left. And then throughout the summer of 2021, we spent the whole summer in Gibraltar, which was great. So we were there for the vote and interviews, but then also getting to feel and capture and live and experience Gibraltar and the unique place that it is. And
could you just tell us what the vote was for people who don't know how they voted, which way they went?
So on June 24th, 2021, Gibraltar voted to decriminalize abortion.
Wow.
Yeah. Yeah, it's very cool.
Yes.
I mean, especially since the previous law was a draconian law from the 1800s or before that, a very long time ago.
Right. But which is interesting that what they did there, but then what we did here.
Yes, on June 24th, 2022, exactly 1 year later, the Supreme Court overturned Roe. So pretty much as one country progresses, the other one is regressing. And this is something that's what the story in my documentary wound up evolving into, and it wound up covering. Originally, in one way, it was about finding out the nuances on both sides.
Right.
But then it very much became not that, given what was happening in the U.S. with the issue, with what was gearing up. Given, in Gibraltar, what was really fascinating, it was one of the leaders of the pro-life movement in Gibraltar. And she said to me, she's like, Rosita, I really don't understand why the issue of abortion is so politicized in the United States. Why? And I'm like, yeah, you and me both, right?
Right, yeah.
And so we had this whole conversation from my perspective as an American and from hers as a European, watching it like, even though it's divisive there for religious reasons, like Catholics and such, they were like, and yet this is still a healthcare issue. They still, both sides are framing it in that framework of healthcare. And here, I found in some ways so often, especially before there's become a lot more openness, the silver lining of all the openness of discussion that's been coming out the past 18 months, here, it's always been framed as this political issue. Yes, with touches of religion on various sides, but as a full-on political issue and something that both sides can mobilize around, especially the more conservative side. What was really interesting is in Gibraltar, we got to interview the medical director of the whole medical system there. And we wound up, of course, talking about how the United States has the highest rate of maternal mortality in all developed countries. How is this possible? I mean, I'm sure that there are a few other documentaries that recently, brilliant documentaries, have just come out covering that. But it still all has to do with that issue of reproductive rights, healthcare, human rights, and the oppression of women. When all of this is going and swirling through your head, especially if you're sitting in the Mediterranean, in Gibraltar, watching all of this happening, you, as an artist, it's like all of this has been put into a cauldron, a bubbling cauldron, and you're stewing and stewing and stewing. And especially when experts in the field of reproductive justice and legal experts are really talking about how, in reality, access to abortion is essential to democracy. We, as American citizens in the United States of America, our whole Constitution is about freedom and access and just democracy, right? There can't be any argument into, how we formed as a country after the American Revolution and all of that stuff. We've learned it in school so many times. But the point being that it's always been against oppression, the oppression of the powerful against those that are disempowered or don't have as much power. And right now we're living in this age where I feel like we've stepped through the looking glass, fallen down the rabbit hole. Never in my life did I think that I would have rights taken away from me from my own country, by my own country. It's just very disturbing. And so the documentary has naturally evolved in that same way because it was about, as a documentarian, you have to make a decision. Are you going to box yourself into what the original thought of the story was, or are you going to allow for it to roll out and you just grab the camera and start shooting and start going with it and seeing what then comes about? Obviously, there needs to be a framework, but we could feel it. There was like an instinct, like an intuition that we had. And then we were like, okay, there's something here. And I knew, and I was like, okay, let's keep going. Ultimately, yes, it was my decision to keep going and not cut it off after Gibraltar, but to keep going. And then we were there on December 1st, the opening oral arguments in DC, Rachel and I, in our big heavy coats because it was freezing. And then we were back in LA in May for the SCOTUS leak. And then we were here in LA for June 24th, 2022, when the Supreme Court overturned Roe. I mean, you can't get more cinematic than that. The fact that June 24th, 2021, Gibraltar decriminalized abortion, and then June 24th, 2022, the United States is pretty much federally effectively criminalizing abortion. You can't write that better, right? I mean, the universe. And this style of the documentary became very clear in the beginning that it had to be told through my eyes as the narrator, especially when looking into Gibraltar. Because what was fascinating about Gibraltar was, as an American, you're like, what is this place? This mysterious cool little place that they're British, but then you walk 10 feet and you're in Spain, full on Andalusia, Spain.
Yeah.
And so in that way, it kind of became a Michael Moore meets Brian Fogel meets Petra Costa type of personal documentary that we're following me in this journey, and things are just happening. Crazy things are just happening, and we're just like, what in the world? And seeing it more from this regular person's perspective. Like, I'm not, I wasn't a full-on, say, like, activist or anything like that. I'm very much the artist, the creative, and a producer.
Right.
And seeing it in that way, we found, because we have beginnings cuts of the film and everything, and showing it internally to the team, they're like, well, we love that we really connect with you as this relatable person just traveling through this journey. And that really hit me. I was like, okay, well, we have something here, so let's keep going. And now with everything, because I'm half Iranian, so British and European on my mother's side, and then Iranian, and then I'm a first generation American, born and raised here.
Wow.
And so with everything happening in Iran, and I have family there, it's just been like, oh my God. And then what's happening in Iran is effectively the first female-led revolution globally. And so then that really tied into the ending of the documentary in terms of where we were going with it. And so that's kind of become part of it as well, both because of me culturally, of what I am, who I am, and also because of the discussions that we're having with regards to human rights, bodily autonomy, freedom. The log line changed. It was about women's choices, voices, and yada, yada, yada. I've forgotten it now because it's not relevant to the current documentary. And now our log line is, first they came for our bodies, now they've come for a democracy.
Where are you at with the project and its release?
So at the moment, we are in the middle of editing and post-production. So the first 2 acts, so it's like a 3-act play in a way, the documentary. And the first 2 acts are pretty complete, just doing little nips and tucks here and there. And then Act 3 is what we are focused on right now in the edit room. And in parallel to that, we're also kind of trying to raise our additional finishing funds that we need to actually get it across the finishing line. So it's that hurdle that so often I've been finding out with fellow documentary filmmakers that we all tend to hit at this point in the journey. So we're running a crowdfunding campaign with a great organization called Philanthropy Foundation. The head of the company has been just incredibly supportive of the issue and the project. And he said, hey, we can help by helping host your crowdfunding campaign on the platform we use, which is givebutter.com. And if anybody would like to contribute and help us out, it's givebutter.com/the Gibraltar Project. So the title of the documentary.
So do you mind telling us how much you'd like to raise and where you're at with raising?
So we're trying to raise about $37,000, and we are at $1,300. So we're on the lower end right now. So it's tough.
They need your help.
We need your help. We need your help to bring us together. Every little bit helps. Everybody giving a little bit, it all adds up. So
Right. And what would the money go towards?
So it'll go towards specifically what we call offline editing. So finishing that edit, that query, things like being able to use certain archival photos and footage, and then a lot of the finishing costs, things like color grading and fixing sound, because especially in documentary, we're using multiple cameras and multiple devices, which for us
Right.
as viewers, if we're quickly uploading these individual photos, say to YouTube, we don't notice anything. But when you're in post and you're putting all of the different devices together, you really notice the ups and downs of the differences in sound quality. And so that's something technically that you have to get on a sound engineer to really clean up. Having the ability to cover a lot of those technical costs to make it so that when you go and you see the documentary, the thing that, kind of like the difference that kind of jumps out we tend to see in films is that when the sound is off, it ruins the whole experience. Doesn't matter
Yes.
how great the acting was, how good the story is, how beautiful the imagery. When the sound is not done properly, you're like, oh my God.
Yeah. Now, are you hiring a music composer, or are you doing just going purchasing a music library?
We actually have been collaborating with a composer in London, and working with an executive producer. She's originally from Ireland, and she's amazing. And so we've been collaborating with them. So the funds would also be going towards covering the cost of finishing up that music composition so that we can include it, that they've specially created for the film.
How wonderful. I mean, this is a totally international film, internationally filmed and internationally crewed.
Yes, absolutely. Our editor, Brenda Morrissey, the fabulous Brenda Morrissey, she's Dublin based. She's Irish, and I wanted to get an Irish editor involved, and a female Irish editor at that, because they just lived through the issue of the decriminalization of abortion there, and we've all, I think, heard some of the stories of what the strict Catholic influence has been on various things, whether it was forcing women to have babies and then taking them away. And I mean, we all remember that movie Philomena with Judi Dench. And so through the process, and especially through the process of the beginning of the edit, working with Brenda has been incredible, because she had these amazing stories as well. I mean, talk about some, it was very, very interesting as well, because you have, at this point in post-production in a documentary, it's the director and it's the editor. And so that relationship is very close. It's like, when you're on set, it's the director and the cinematographer. And in this case, in the so-called virtual edit room, which was done through like Google Meet meetings and WhatsApp calls.
Right.
You wind up discussing so many things, especially about something so political like this. And it was such a cool experience, just living through and still living through that experience of putting together the story around something that is so relevant, so heated, and we're literally living through history. I mean, and it's still ongoing history, because this issue hasn't ended.
Yeah, and how involved it feels like religion. In particular could be Catholic, which is just phenomenal that so many decisions are based on religion.
It's disturbing, really. I mean, look at
Yeah,
all the wars that have been based on religion. Have we not learned our lesson as humanity, as a species? Um,
yeah.
and if you look at the Supreme Court, yes, June 24th, they overturned Roe, but prior to that, the previous three decisions that they made, again, were almost influenced and based upon these justices, the majority, because not the dissenting justices, but the ones that pushed through the decisions, were based on their own ultra conservative beliefs that they're forcing down the throats of the rest of the populace who don't, the majority of which don't agree with it.
I mean, I guess it's just a process, and more people just have to speak out and vote and be a part of the solution than the problem. Um, do you have any words of encouragement to the future documentarians in starting a project, like what you've learned going in that maybe you'd give as advice to somebody if they're thinking about a project?
Well, with documentary especially, I would say whatever topic you are thinking about or wanting to cover, really make sure you're incredibly passionate about it, that it literally is do or die, because otherwise it's soul destroying and it is completely draining. And, you know, very few documentarians are, doing an HBO documentary fully financed. So the majority of documentarians, it's like full on indie grassroots guerrilla style documentary, especially when it comes to the financing. Most are especially using their own finances or crowdfunding and everything. So you really have to be prepared for the sacrifices emotionally, financially, just all around. Um, and especially if you're the leader of that documentary team, you need to make sure that you're driving force, that you have that both that passion and that need, like this project has to happen because the message of it is bigger than me, is bigger than any individual in it. So I would say be careful in the topics you choose to cover, and that is not going to be something that you get halfway down and you're questioning yourself about whether or not it really matters. Because I think that could be the worst thing.
Yeah, you definitely have to be passionate about the project. Otherwise, you're going to,
Yeah.
float out of it. Um, yeah, and I was just kind of curious, like, because it takes money to start a project, and most of the time it's our own money that we're putting in to pay people, or you're hoping that people will donate their time for a while. Did you do any fundraising before the project started, or after? Like, how did you go about getting your funds to even start the project?
Um, so we had an angel investor who disappeared on us. But then, I had some money from savings from a couple of gigs. So we used that. And then we did an Indiegogo and got a little bit. And so it's been continual. Like there hasn't really been a moment that we've stopped fundraising because we couldn't. Because it was like we
Right.
raised some, got to do the next part, then had to raise some more and do the next part. And it's been that constant thing. And right now it's a real push because we need to wrap and finish the documentary because the story has naturally we found the conclusion of the story, of this chapter story. And so there really is that big urgency now. And now because we're at the stage where we can actually show potential folks, like we have the trailer and we can say, hey, we have the first 75 minutes cut, we're working on the last, act 3, as it were. It does change the conversation versus when it's just an idea.
What are you editing the project on?
We are editing on Avid and also Premiere.
Great.
Mostly Avid though.
Is there any last thoughts you'd like to put out there, or anything you want us to know about your project in closing?
Um, it's been an incredible journey. Um, Putting together this project. Have met some incredible people from different facets, not just film side of it, but activists to the legal eagles and the folks that are on really the front lines of this fight in a very unique way that really isn't covered at all in, I don't want to say mainstream media, but just we're not actively going out there and looking for the lawyer's TikTok and saying, like, what are they talking about in this issue, really, you know?
Right.
And yet, as we've seen, because of what happened with the Supreme Court, the legal side is a massively important, impactful side to it. So, yeah, I mean, it's there's a lot of things that happened that were unexpected, and especially how the story evolved. And so it's just been this, and it is continuing to still be this incredible roller coaster. So, yeah, we have to bring it to the end so we can share it with everybody.
Yeah, well, I can't wait to see it, and thank you so much for being on the show today.
Thank you for inviting me. It's been incredible.
Thank you so much for listening. I encourage you to get out there and make a film. Reach out to your local filmmakers group to get involved and connect. Please subscribe to the show if you like it, and follow me on Instagram at Tammy Magaro. Until we meet again, what's your story?